I wanted to call the March 10th, 2021 meeting of the Palm Springs Planning Commission to order. Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Irwin?
Present.
Commissioner Hirschbein?
Present.
Commissioner Lewin?
Here.
Commissioner Song?
Present.
Vice Chair Maruzzi?
Here.
And Chair Wormack.
Present.
6 members present. We have a quorum.
Can I have a report on the posting of the agenda, please?
Madam Chair, the agenda was posted on Thursday, March the 4th. This meeting has been noticed and posted in accordance with state law.
Thank you. We're at the acceptance of the agenda. I would like to propose that we put item 4A, which is the Studio R&D Architects project in Pinnacle View of Edward F. Freeman of Pinnacle View LLC into the consent calendar. And I would make that as a motion.
Second.
Can we have a motion on accepting the agenda with that change? I guess that's my motion, Stu.
Yes, Madam Chair, you made the motion and Mr.
Fine.
Hirschbein seconded.
Fine. Can you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Irwin?
Oh, excuse me, Terry. What we've been doing now is calling first the person who makes the motion, then the seconder, and then going through the roll.
Okay. So Chair Wormack?
Yes.
Commissioner Hirschbein?
Yes.
Commissioner Irwin?
Yes.
Commissioner Lewin?
Yes.
Commissioner Song?
Yes.
And Vice Chair Maruzzi?
Yes.
Thank you. Now we are at public comments. This time has been set aside for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on consent calendar and other agenda items and items of general interest within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission. Please note that the Planning Commission is prohibited from taking action on items not listed on the posted agenda. 3 minutes will be allowed for each speaker. Testimony on public hearings may be offered now or at the time of the public hearing. And if you are interested in commenting on the consent calendar or the discussion items, this would be the time to make your comments. Are there
Madam Chair, our first speaker this evening is Maribel Nunez. If we could have Ms. Nunez begin her comments, please.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Maribel Nunez with Inland Equity Partnership, Inland Equity Community Land Trust. Thank you, Planning Commission, for letting me speak. And I wanted to do public comments on item 5A and 5B. It's a conversation that will include about housing and then potentially some of the housing element and RENA numbers. So I am a big community advocate. I have the pleasure of attending one of your prior Planning Commission meetings and very active in the city of Palm Springs doing community engagement. And so just wanted to hear an update and why there might be a delay for the Palm Springs housing element. I've been doing a lot of community engagement also in the city of Riverside, and they already are in the third housing element workshop. They have a website, they have a survey and an interactive map. So just wanted to, kind of hear, why there might be a delay on the housing element discussion, especially because we need to incorporate the environmental justice and fair housing this time around on the 6th cycle. And then I think that in the last city council meeting, that it might be in May that some of this might be brought up. And I feel that there's not going to be a lot of opportunities to do community input opportunities for these workshops. But so I just wanted to bring that up. And we are engaging with some Palm Springs residents. So once we're ready to start the process to hear more of where we are in Palm Springs on the housing element. And one of the things I wanted to take the opportunity is to look at some of the things that Riverside and other cities have done. They created their website in Palm Springs. They have a survey for people to fill out online. They have an interactive map where the planning department and the consultant of the housing element identified some potential opportunity zones, and we recommended that there's a stronger legend so that we could know where we can do some input on zoning. But like I said, definitely see us as a partner. And I know that the Planning Commission is one of the places where a lot of these conversations will also happen. And so wanted to bring this up since there was housing in the arena that was going to be brought up. And so please, let's try to move this process along so that there's multiple opportunities for community input before, during, and after the housing element draft. So thank you so much for your time.
Can I just ask you a question? Would you give staff your phone number and contact information so that we can stay in touch with you with the general plan work group and invite you to attend as this gets discussed?
Yes, and I believe they do have my information, but I could put it on, I don't know if it's Mr. David or Mr. Flynn. They have my information. I don't know if they need my information, but they have.
Yeah, we have her contact, Chair.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Is there anyone else in the public who wishes to speak? There being no other comments, the public hearing is closed. We now move to the consent calendar. The item that is on the consent calendar is Studio A&D Architects on behalf of Edward F. Friedman of Pinnacle View LLC for a major architectural application to construct a 4,276 square foot single-family residence on a 20,705 square foot hillside parcel located at 2610 Winter Sun Drive in the Desert Palisades specific plan. My understanding is that the items from AAC are already conditioned in the staff report. Is that correct?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
Can I have a motion on this, please? Commissioner Hirschbein.
I'll move to approve the consent calendar.
And I'll second.
Okay.
Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Hirschbein,
Yes.
Commissioner Song,
Yes.
Commissioner Irvin,
Yes.
Commissioner Lewin,
Yes.
Vice Chair Maruzzi,
Yes.
and Chair Womack.
Yes, it's a beautiful project and it's approved unanimously. Thank you. Okay, we're moving right along. Our next item is item 2A, Evolved Engineering LLC on behalf of Morgue LLC for a conditional use permit to operate a cannabis facility to include type 6 non-volatile manufacturing, cultivation, dispensary, distribution, and a lounge in a vacant industrial building within an existing business park located at 1241 South Gene Autry Trail, Zone M1. And I believe we've been asked to continue this until a date certain on March 24th, 2021.
Yes, that's correct, Madam Chair. There's some additional information that staff will need to provide to the planning commissioners. We would request that this item be continued for 2 weeks to March the 24th, and we will continue the hearing to that date.
Can I have a motion, please?
I'll move to continue to March 24th.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Can you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Lewin,
Yes.
Commissioner Song,
Yes.
Commissioner Irvin,
Yes.
Commissioner Hirschbein,
Yes.
Vice Chair Maruzzi,
Yes.
and Chair Womack.
Yes. The item is continued. The next item is a public hearing item. The City of Palm Springs to amend portions of Chapter 91.00 Chapter 92.00, Chapter 93.00, and Chapter 94.00 of the Palm Springs Zoning Code to adopt revisions to the architectural review process and the associated entitlement process. This is a public hearing item. Can we have a staff report, please, before the public hearing?
Madam Chair and members of the commission, as you'll recall, 2 weeks ago, we had our initial discussion on proposed revisions to the city's architectural review process and other entitlement processes. We have the formalized ordinance before you this evening for your input and your vote. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to provide to you, briefer than the one that we did 2 weeks ago, but I'd like to talk about a number of items, do a brief review of the proposal, and then also address some of the questions and concerns that came up 2 weeks ago. So with that, I'll go ahead and start here. So going back to why we are doing this, as you'll recall, this is under the direction of the City Council. They had asked us to look at our architectural review process and other entitlement process and look at ways that we could streamline those processes. And so again, this project was initiated by the City Council with the intent of streamlining processes. Working with our subcommittee, we are proposing to separate the architectural review process into 2 parts, common with what other cities typically do for these types of applications. The Planning Commission will be responsible for the development permit process, which is a review of the use, the site plan, conformance to development standards, the general plan, reviewing impacts, reviewing height and massing, etc. One of the comments that we had from the Planning Commission 2 weeks ago, we were previously calling this the site development permit. It was thought that that might be a little bit too limiting in terms of its description. And so what I'm proposing to you this evening and in the ordinance is that we call it a development permit. So hopefully that addresses that concern. The second part of the process would be that which is given to the Architectural Advisory Committee, and that is for architectural review, where they look at the specifics of the architectural design and details, the materials, colors, landscape, lighting, and issues associated with those. And so again, it's proposed to be a 2-part process. Another critical component of this process is a requirement for a pre-submittal conference with staff. In trying to bring a better application forward to both the Planning Commission and the Architectural Advisory Committee, it was felt by the subcommittee that using a pre-submittal process wherein a staff member will review schematic designs for a project with the applicant and look at issues such as conformance to development standards, and also review and comment on the architectural design of the project. In addition, the pre-submittal conference would be used to provide a checklist of required materials to the applicant, again, looking to get a complete application with all of the information that's needed for our boards and committees to review the application. Looking at a graphic of the process, step 1 would be the pre-submittal conference with staff. Step 2 would be the formal submittal of the applications, both the architectural review and the development permit application. Sorry, I didn't correct the name of it on this, this illustration. Step 3 would be the Planning Commission action on the site development permit. If council action is required, for example, if there's an associated general plan amendment or change of zone application, it would then go to City Council for approval. Once the development permit application is approved, it would then be forwarded to the Architectural Advisory Committee to do the architectural review portion of the application. We had talked last time about the criteria that the Planning Commission will use to evaluate the development permit. I won't go through all of these, but again, it gives you an idea of the responsibilities of the Planning Commission and the things that you are charged with in terms of your reviews. One of the questions that did come up last time was there was a concern about, do the criteria give the Planning Commission enough discretion? There was a concern that it was too much involved with looking at conformance to numerical things such as parking spaces or setbacks. But in reviewing the criteria that we are proposing, the following are actually discretionary reviews where the Planning Commission needs to evaluate and assess if the application is compliant. So number one, conformance to the general plan. While that seems relatively straightforward, and it is in terms of density or floor area ratio, sometimes there are larger issues of compliance with the general plan that the Planning Commission needs to review and make a recommendation on. One of the cases that we had recently was the proposed off-site parking lot. There was discussion at the Planning Commission level as to whether or not that was consistent with the general plan. And so you might see things like that in the future where you're evaluating the whole of the application for its consistency with the purpose and intent of the general plan. Criterion number two, you all need to make an assessment relative to the use and whether or not it's detrimental or has impacts to adjacent properties. That's not something that's just a numerical requirement, but rather you need to look at a number of factors and make a determination if there will be impacts. Criterion number 4 and criterion number 5 both require you to make findings of consistency. One is relative to the massing of the project. Another one is relative to the placement of the project. And so you need to evaluate the surrounding area and make a determination that it is consistent or is not consistent. Criterion number 7, relative to the adequacy of on-site circulation. This is not a numerical assessment there. It's asking you to use judgment in terms of the layout relative to vehicular circulation and just as important, pedestrian circulation on the site. Criterion number 8 deals with the design and integration of stormwater management. Many times here in the desert, we use stormwater retention areas as open space or recreation areas. And so your assessment of how we might integrate those into the open space of a site does require some judgment on your part. Criterion number 10 deals with CEQA issues and the environmental evaluation. As you're familiar in the past, as we've had discussions about environmental impacts, your review of those analyses is important and does require judgment on your part. And then finally, the last criterion relative to impacts to general health, safety, and welfare. This is kind of the catch-all criteria that we have to assess any impacts that the project may have that isn't addressed under other criteria that we have. And so those are all criteria that require some judgment on the part of the Planning Commission and why you are essential in terms of doing the reviews on these types of applications. Another question that I had that came up in the interim between our meetings was how would new subdivisions be approved? And so I wanted to provide you with just an overview of that process as we didn't discuss that at our last meeting. And this will be the example of a 25 lot subdivision that is being brought in under the R1E or our 5,000 square foot lot development standards. So in terms of a subdivision, just like any other application, it would start with a pre-submittal conference with staff. So we would review it for conformance to the R1E development standards. And then we would also review the proposed house models, different plans that they'd be proposing to develop for conformance to our architectural standards. And then, as with other applications, provide a checklist of submittal requirements. The next step in the process would be the formal submittal. And so they'd be submitting their tentative map application, their development permit application, and their architectural review application all at the same time. Step 3 of the process would be for the Planning Commission to review the tentative map and the development permit applications. Under the tentative map, you're reviewing it for conformance to the R1E development standards, also looking at conformance to minimum streets, etc. Under the development permit, you'd be looking at issues such as the layout of the site. You'd be looking at any on-site open space or recreation areas. If there's some type of a perimeter wall, you'd be looking at the adequacy of the landscape buffer in front of the wall, and looking at general issues of the layout of the subdivision. You would also be able to provide comments to the AAC on the design of the individual units, or, for example, the landscape plan, the landscape plan that would be for the individual lots. So if you have comments in terms of there should be at least one street tree in front of every house or things like that, you would be able to pass those comments on to the AAC as they go into the in-depth look at the architecture and the landscaping. Once you approve the tentative map and the development permit, it would then advance to the architectural review portion of the review, with the AAC looking at the individual houses, the exterior architecture of the houses, the colors, the materials, the variation in the houses, so that we don't have repetition of the same units right next to each other. They would be looking at the landscape materials. They would be looking at any perimeter wall materials, the lighting for the subdivision, and things like that. And so that's an example of how a subdivision would go through the new approval process. Talking about other changes that we're proposing as part of this look at streamlining our application processes, relative to signage, as we discussed at the last meeting, we're proposing to allow the AAC to have final action on sign program waivers. And then the Planning Commission would have approval of sign districts rather than the City Council. So those are two changes to our sign process. Looking at conditional use permits, as we discussed at the last meeting, there's a number of conditional uses that require City Council approval currently. We're proposing to give that authority to the Planning Commission instead and streamline that list, so that the Planning Commission will have final action on conditional use permits for cell towers, utility installations, private educational institutions, government facilities, and social service providers. One of the changes that we didn't talk about at the last meeting, but that we're proposing as part of this package, is relative to maps that go through the approval process. Currently, as it stands, City Council is required to approve tentative maps. Planning Commission makes a recommendation with City Council approval. However, under state law, it's not required to be in that particular order. State law allows for the Planning Commission to approve tentative maps. And so what we're proposing is that we would make a change to the municipal code, which is where these regulations are listed, so that Planning Commission would have final action on tentative maps. City Council, however, under state law, needs to retain authority of approval of final map. A final map is actually just fairly administrative, making sure that the final map conforms to the tentative map. But again, that's a requirement of state law, and so we need to maintain that. But that would assist in helping to shorten the process for tentative maps by having Planning Commission have final action on that. We discussed 2 weeks ago about changes to specific plans, looking at specific plans that identify an approval process, and specifically look at having the AAC first with the changes to the proposed process. We would need to amend 3 of the specific plans that are currently in place. Based on your comments at the last meeting, what staff is proposing to do is we will bring those forward to you at a later date with the changes that we discussed relative to the downtown specific plan and the 2 other plans that would also need to be amended. But again, those will come to you at a later date in a public hearing so that we can get your input and direction and take action on those at that time. The Architectural Advisory Committee had a presentation on the proposed changes on Monday night. And I'm just going to go through some of the questions and comments that they made at that time. You do have an excerpt of their minutes that we emailed to you earlier this week. Their comments and questions were as follows. Just as you had concerns about the two separate applications, they also voiced concerns about two separate applications as being a little bit more unwieldy. My response to them was, we can take care of that administratively in terms of making that a little bit simpler for applicants, because you as the Planning Commission have requested to see the same set of materials that the AAC sees. What we can do is have a standardized list of submittal materials that will address both the site development permit and the architectural review application. So the applicant just needs to conform to one checklist of materials. And then secondly, rather than having them fill out two separate application forms and pay two separate fees, we can combine that into a single application form with a single fee. So that way it is easier for the applicants. So again, while it seems a little problematic to have two separate described permits, administratively, we can make that process a little bit more seamless for the applicants. And that's not something that needs to be in the ordinance itself, but is handled on the administrative end of things. There was also a question about what happens if the Architectural Advisory Committee doesn't approve an architectural review application after two meetings. There is the appeal process where the applicant could appeal that decision to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission would then have final action on that. Or the other alternative is for the applicant to resubmit their architectural review application that is more in line with the criteria. If the AAC is denying an application, it's because they can't make the findings. And so the applicant would need to address the findings that couldn't be made by making revisions to their application package. And so they could submit a new application with those revisions and come back. Also, AAC wanted to verify the responsibilities of the different bodies relative to the two application types, just as you did at your meeting 2 weeks ago. We also had a question about cell towers. There was an application for a cell tower on a city parking garage at AAC a couple of meetings back, where they were proposing to add on to the height of the parking garage by extending, I believe, some mechanical equipment screening. The question was, if cell towers are only reviewed by the Planning Commission, how would that occur? In thinking about the response to that, where they are adding on to a building in order to accommodate a cell tower, we would probably have them take that application through the AAC as well for architectural review, because they are expanding a building. And so we do have the ability to still have that type of review, even though Planning Commission would have final action on cell towers. So there is a way for us to accommodate that under the new process. Otherwise, if they're doing a standalone cell tower with the standard accessory building at the base that they typically have to house their equipment, it would just go directly to the Planning Commission. Another great question that we had from the AAC on Monday night was about the implementation schedule. That this is a significant change to the way that we do things now. How does staff intend to roll that out? My response was that we would probably wait for a couple of months to roll the process out. One of the things that we would need to do is we would need to look at staffing in terms of hiring a new staff member. We would also need to make some modifications to our forms in terms of the forms that the applicants use to begin setting up the pre-submittal conferences with our staff member. So I would imagine that if this is adopted by the City Council, if these process changes are adopted, we would probably need to wait a couple of months to begin the implementation of those changes. And so there would need to be some time period. We would also need to do outreach to our applicants, to our architects, our developers, our engineers, who frequently submit applications, to make them aware of the changes in the process as well. So we would need a couple of months to be able to do that. Another concern that was raised was, are we either cutting down or eliminating opportunities for public involvement? And the answer is no, we wouldn't be doing that. Items that are public hearings will continue to be public hearings, and so members of the public will still have opportunity to comment. With the changes to our hillside review process for single-family homes, we will continue to do the mailed notice to adjacent property owners so that they can participate in the Architectural Advisory Committee meetings where those applications are reviewed. Even though we aren't having the second hearing with the Planning Commission, members of the public will still have the opportunity to participate in those meetings with the AAC. So we will still have the same opportunities for public involvement in applications. We also had a question about architectural review for historic structures. There was a question there. It was resolved by the fact that the Historic Site Preservation Board will review the changes to Class 1 and Class 2 historic structures. And so only major changes come through the Architectural Advisory Committee, but there is a separate review process by the Historic Site Preservation Board. So we are still doing the same type of review that we do currently with historic structures. Also, the very sharp eyes of the Architectural Advisory Committee found a couple of errors in my table of proposed changes. Those errors are not in your draft ordinances that you have before you, but I will correct that table before we forward this on to the City Council. In particular, I failed to note that multifamily development, new multifamily development, will still be subject to architectural review, except in those cases where state law exempts it. So multifamily will still go through the architectural review process unless otherwise exempted by state law. So that is kind of the whole of the comments and questions that came up through the Architectural Advisory Committee meeting. I don't see any significant changes to the draft ordinance as proposed. Many of these questions and comments can be addressed administratively. So going back to one of our questions, how is this proposed change going to help us streamline processes? Just going through, number one, the elimination of duplicate reviews, giving authority to either AAC or to the Planning Commission to reduce the number of reviews that are required, the use of a pre-submittal conference to make sure that we have complete application packages up front and can address concerns or issues with the applicant before they get too far down the road on the design and the submittal of their application. Also, it's intended to eliminate the overlap of responsibilities. And that brings up one point. Madam Chair, you brought up the fact in the architectural review criteria, I still have a criterion that addresses massing. And we had talked about giving that responsibility to the Planning Commission. I will make that change in the ordinance based on your direction there. Again, trying to keep the responsibilities separate so that we don't have the back and forth or the overlap of those responsibilities. And then finally, one of the things I didn't talk about last time was the fact that we are reducing the number of application types that have to be approved by the City Council. That will also help to shorten the process by relieving the City Council of certain duties and giving those duties to the Planning Commission. So with that, that concludes my presentation to you. One of the things I wanted to talk about just very briefly is in terms of implementation, looking at how we are rolling out and then talking also about design guidelines. In phase one of this project, we obviously have the ordinance changes, which will go through to City Council. Also, following that, once we have adoption by City Council, I would then follow that up with the amendments to the specific plan. Those need to be at a public hearing. There's a process that we need to go through for that. So I would follow that after the adoption of the ordinance itself. And then we also, hopefully, if approved by City Council, would be able to hire a staff member to implement our pre-submittal conferences. What I see as being phase two of this project is development of design guidelines. My recommendation to the City Council is that they appoint a subcommittee that will include members of the Planning Commission and the Architectural Advisory Committee. The Palm Springs Architectural Alliance would like to be involved in that process. And so we would recommend that they also be involved. And so go through a subcommittee process in developing those guidelines and preparing them for adoption. Also, as part of phase 2, or what I'm calling phase 2, is to do a check-in after 12 months of adoption of the ordinance in terms of seeing how it's working. And if we, as the Planning Commission, need to make adjustments to the process, we would be able to do so at that time. And so that's just looking at the phases of rolling this out in terms of adoption, design guidelines, and so forth. So with that, that is the conclusion of my presentation. Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you if you have questions or comments. We also need to open this up for public comment as well.
What I'd like to propose is that we open this for public comment now, and then we go back to questions. And since the applicant is the city, this would be a public comment for members of the public who wish to speak. David, do we have any members of the public who've signed up to speak?
No, Madam Chair, but there are a couple members of the public who are on the video today. So if they do wish to speak, you may please turn on your microphone and provide your public comment.
And if you do, you have 3 minutes for public comment. Seeing no members of the public who are on Zoom with us who've indicated that they'd like to speak, I will close the public hearing and go back to first questions and comments of Flynn on this. Do people, let's go to questions first, and then we can go to general comments and then take action. So are there questions of Flynn from Commissioner Song?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe this is getting into the weeds, but I read from some of the questions that as we have a liaison or a planning commissioner member at the AAC per each month, because of the sequence, does it also help if there would be an AAC member also assigned as part of the planning commission, so they have the background as the project move on to ARC? And then to extend that one more step would be, I think it would be helpful also to, if voluntary basis, if also a planning commissioner is part of the pre-application meeting as a liaison, to understand the case from the beginning, if we can volunteer to do so. I know we're all very busy, but having that kind of background and context information may help at least for maybe the first year of the process. So those are the 2 questions. Can we have a liaison for both bodies? And then number 3, could we volunteer at least when this first gets started to have volunteers member at the pre-application?
So relative to having liaisons, I think that's more than appropriate. It's a practice that has been well used in the past. This would be a little bit different in terms of having members of the AAC be a liaison also to the Planning Commission. But again, I think that would help the process. Doesn't need to be in the ordinance. That's something that we can do administratively. So again, that's up to the direction of the Planning Commission. I think that's a terrific idea. In terms of having Planning Commission representatives at the pre-submittal conference, the difficulty is that it would be a huge commitment of time on the part of the Planning Commission members. And then also it's going to be in the middle of the day during the workday. It may be very difficult for members of the Planning Commission to attend those meetings. So there's nothing that would prevent you from doing so that I can think of. But again, it's just the scheduling would be very difficult.
And the AAC asked the same question, and Flynn gave the same answer. And my feeling is we would get too deep into staff functions if we attempted to do that. That we do want a difference, a separation between what work staff does and what work we do. Are there other comments? Are there questions? Commissioner Hirschbein?
Thank you. Again, thank you to the subcommittee and to staff. This is a lot of work, and I think it's really coming together. I just have a couple of specific questions. You in the presentation, you mentioned sign program waiver, and I've never heard that term used before. What is a sign program waiver?
Sorry, speaking without my microphone on. Sign program waiver is where they are requesting some type of variation from the standard. So they're either asking for an increase in area or letter size or something like that. Currently, that authority is the Planning Commission, and what we're proposing is to give that authority to the Architectural Advisory Committee.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. I've got a couple more questions. So, you know, a review process kind of assumes that there's going to be comments, and based on the comments, there's going to be changes. So putting AAC at the end and then allowing them to make comments that would necessitate changes, how would Planning Commission and also Council for that matter become aware of those changes and make sure that those two bodies are okay with the changes that they're either requiring or suggesting?
Yeah. So in terms of changes, AAC is going to be very limited in what they can do relative to the approval by Planning Commission and or City Council. Keeping in mind that we're trying to keep the responsibility separate of Planning Commission and AAC. The question that came up, I think at AAC was, you know, what if in looking at the architectural review application, we see that there may be a need to adjust the footprint of a building. As you're aware, you all as the Planning Commission under the development permit are more or less establishing the location and placement of the building. You're establishing the square footage, et cetera. There might be cases where a minor change to the footprint of the building may be permissible. So for example, if under the architectural review, they need to push out a wall by 6 inches or a foot to give some relief to the facade or something like that, that would be an insignificant change to the site plan. But if it becomes more than that, where it is either moving the footprint of the building or increasing the square footage, that's not something that they would be able to do as part of architectural review, because again, that has been approved and set by the Planning Commission. And so what we are hoping is that by separating those two responsibilities, AAC will be working with the approval that has been granted by the Planning Commission and doing the architectural review within the boundaries of that approval.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to play what if, but putting aside changes to the site plan itself, can you envision a case where an applicant has a commercial building in a retail project, and it's a Spanish Revival design, and PC loves it, Council loves it, AAC gets it, and they're like, Spanish Revival, we're all about contemporary modern design. We want you to change it. That's not site plan. Is there any, would they be able to do that? Or, and if they would, then wouldn't we want to see it again?
Technically, architectural review is under the AAC. However, if it's a substantially different project than what was presented to the Planning Commission, that becomes problematic. And we may need to be able to bring it back to Planning Commission before that change is approved by the Architectural Advisory Committee.
So you're saying there's some leeway staff would have discretion if there's some major change, not site plan, but other kinds of major changes, to bring it back to Planning Commission for review?
Yeah, there is language under the proposed ordinance that does give certain discretion in terms of modifications, in terms of taking it either to Planning Commission or to AAC. So we would have the ability as staff to be able to make a determination. But But it comes back again to what did the Planning Commission see and approve, and is the AAC working within the boundaries of that? If it's a significant change, then that becomes problematic, that it's something that really would need to come back to the Planning Commission.
Okay.
We're hoping to avoid that, but
Yeah, but like I said, I'm playing what if.
yeah.
Okay, so I got one more. I think I got one more. Could you put up the slide that had your criteria? It was a slide right at the beginning of the presentation.
Yes, just a moment. So starting here.
Yes. So, this discussion started with the idea that we're not, just a checklist. We actually have some discretion and subjective review. And I wanted to understand, does the criteria align with, is it different from, does it in addition to or less than the findings that need to be made?
The criteria is essentially the findings that you need to make.
Okay. Wasn't there a, I don't have I was looking at the cannabis facility, the findings. Wasn't there something about harmony? Is that included in one of these criteria?
No, but keep in mind that the cannabis application that we're reviewing has a conditional use permit, and the findings for a conditional use permit speak about the desirability of the use, harmony, etc. So that's under the conditional use permit.
Okay, so are there findings that need to be made to approve a site development permit?
Yes, these are the findings on these two screens that you need to.
Okay, so when you say criteria, that's kind of synonymous with findings.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question. And so, the idea of harmony with adjacent uses in the community and so forth kind of goes to one of these. I was reading them. Let's see, building placement compatible with adjacent sites. I guess you could talk about that being in harmony. Conformance to development standards. Could you go to the second page? On-site circulation, conformance. Landscape areas, open space, conformance to zoning code. Is that what it's in conformance to?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. And health, safety, welfare impacts, that would go to like, you don't want a waste dump next to residential kind of thing?
Correct. Okay. And then also under the second bullet point here on this slide, look at the permitted use. You also have to assess if the use has impacts to adjacent properties. So
regardless of its compatibility with zoning?
Correct. You still have to assess impacts.
Okay. Okay. And these are similar to the findings / criteria that we have now when we review something that does not require a CUP?
You don't really have some of these in your current criteria for architectural review. This is expanding upon that list, but again, being very specific to the responsibilities for Planning Commission.
But not leaving any off?
Not leaving any off, no.
Okay. And so when we get to CUP, do all of these go away and only the CUP ones come, or is it all of these plus the CUP ones?
If you have a development permit and a conditional use permit, you have to review the findings for both application types. Okay. If you only have a conditional use permit, you would only be reviewing for those findings that are specific to the conditional use permit.
Right. No, I got that. I just want to know if you did both when you have that. Okay. Thank you. That helps a lot. Again, I think it's a big step forward. I as you know, I had some concerns going into it, but I think with some tweaks down the line if we need to. I think it's a good change.
Are there other questions? I have some if there's, I'm not seeing another hand. Commissioner Maruzzi?
Yes, in terms of phase 2, do you have a more specific time frame when you think that this would come about? Is it the 2-month period or?
No, I see that as being a longer process. First of all, we would need direction from City Council to begin the process of the development of design guidelines. They need to authorize staff time to begin that project. And then secondly, in terms of the work of a subcommittee, that typically is not something that could be achieved, within 2 or 3 months. I see that as a longer project, that the subcommittee would need to devote at least 6 months to doing the research and the formulation and going through that process. So I see it as something of a longer process.
And it wouldn't be able to start until after the council has approved this first.
Correct. City Council again needs to authorize that project.
Hopefully it would be this calendar year. I mean, it seems like.
Yeah, I would imagine that when they discuss these ordinance changes at that point in time, they could give direction to staff to start that process if they choose to do so.
What about the date for reviewing the downtown specific plan in section 14 plans, but specifically the downtown one?
So that's something that we could begin right after the adoption of the ordinance. There is a requirement for public noticing for those types of changes. So it would take us a couple of months to do that. With the section 14 specific plan, we would need to coordinate with the tribe to make sure that they're okay with those changes. With the Desert Palisades plan, we'd need to coordinate with the developer of that parcel. I'm pretty certain that he would be supportive of those changes. But there is some work that we'd need to do, but we can begin that immediately after the adoption of the proposed changes.
As a planning commission, could we suggest a priority, such as the downtown specific plan being the first that we review?
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine that we would start work on all 3 of them at the same time and bring them through the process together. I think that would probably be the quickest and easiest way to do it.
Would there be a subcommittee approach for these, do you think?
I don't know that you would need to have a subcommittee for that. You've given pretty clear direction, and the intent is to essentially follow this proposed process with the exception of the downtown specific plan. We would bring a draft proposal to you. You all would review, comment, we could make changes and finalize it from there in the public hearings at Planning Commission.
And I assume if it was more complicated, we could have a study session if necessary.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, very good, thank you.
Are there other comments before I go forward? There are a couple of things that I wanted to ask. Implementation, the 3 steps you had for implementation, I think there should be a 4th, which is that we go to electronic applications at the same time. And I don't know if that's possible, but that would certainly streamline the process.
As much as I would love that and would love to commit to that, unfortunately, that's under the auspices of the IT department in terms of rollout. And I'll be quite honest, it's probably 8 months down the road. I would love the 2 to roll out together, but unfortunately, I think we'd be waiting too long.
Okay, maybe what we can say is that rolls out as quickly thereafter as is possible.
And I'll mention that at City Council.
Because it would be, I think it would be helpful to people if that happened. There are a couple of specific things. I did sit in on the AAC discussion, and there was one point of the AAC discussion where they actually talked about it having been helpful to talk about design guidelines and houses with a subdivision with the Planning Commission when we had subcommittees. I'm a little worried, and that didn't get into the notes, but it was a specific comment from, I think, Vice Chair Rotman, who had worked on that with us. I think that should be included, but I actually think if we're approving a subdivision, I think we're going to want to see what the houses look like on the site, or some general sense of what they're going to be, and not just leave all of that to the AAC. Because if you're approving something, and I think we, one project I remember where we didn't approve specific buildings at the beginning, it was a PD, it was Serena Park, we still had some sense of what they were going to be building. And I think it's important to have PC do that before they give a development permit.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, maybe let me talk to design guidelines first. Not all of the subdivisions have design guidelines that are adopted as a document. Certain subdivisions do, or developments do, such as Marilyn, Ascena, Serena Park would probably need those as well. The larger developments would need to have design guidelines. Those would be approved as part of a plan development process typically, or one of the other application types that we typically have with those larger developments. For a smaller development, you typically wouldn't adopt design guidelines, but what you would want to see is the layout of the different models on the sites. And that's something that the Planning Commission would do as part of your tentative map and development permit. Again, you all had requested to see the same materials that the AAC would see. Same thing for subdivisions. You would see the houses, the materials, and things like that as part of your application package, even though you may not be commenting on the specific color combinations. Or the placement of plants.
I do think if we're approving them, we're going to want to know what we're approving.
Yeah.
There are, I can think of some in town that were approved many years ago that I wouldn't want our name attached to. And, some really beautiful things that have come through, and some things that are not that nice. And I do think it's important that we have some view of what's coming through. The other was speaking to an experience that I had in Santa Monica, where the Planning Commission literally approved the project. What went to the design review committee was details, materials. So the Planning Commission had a slightly larger role in terms of what the permit was. And I'm a little nervous about the complete open, it feels like there's an open-endedness here of the development permit, unless we actually are approving a building and a project. So that, I just want to throw that out. That's the one caution I have as this has gotten developed, is that we're not just giving over something that is a certain massing, and then absolutely everything about it after that is going to be developed by the AAC.
Because you are seeing the same application package, and again, I think that is something that you all have made quite clear in terms of being a necessary part of this process. Under the criteria that we've established for the Planning Commission, you are essentially approving the project. Not only are you approving the massing, you're approving specific things such as height, setbacks, et cetera, et cetera. But
and
the role of
the general look of the project as well.
Yeah, the role of the AAC is limited in terms of they can only look at the architectural elements of the project. Now, keep in mind that you will see those too. The question from Commissioner Hirschbein earlier, what if, a completely different architectural style is proposed? I still think that's a substantially different project than what the Planning Commission saw.
And we never had the ability for our, in Santa Monica over those 6 years, I never saw that something that was significantly different went to the review commission, but they always worked with details and always improved the projects.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a concern that I would have would, that was one of the questions that they asked, is what happened if they didn't like, for example, they used something that we both turned down, which was the condos on the Virgin site. And once I think they didn't like it being built around a courtyard. We turned it down because of thinking it didn't conform to the specific plan in terms of retail, the location of retail, and the applicant presented us with a pretty different project than he gave them. That wouldn't happen in the future. And so that's, once it was set at Planning Commission, although as that big a project, I assume you would have brought that into a joint meeting for discussion. But once there's a Planning Commission determination, I wouldn't see that they could take a project that was a Spanish revival project and turn it into a mid-century. Yeah. And that would be, am I correct in that?
You're correct. That would be a substantial change. And, absent any other criteria, if you look at our architectural review criteria, that kind of goes beyond the scope of the Architectural Advisory Committee to change the appearance of an applicant's project. They're bringing forth a project and we're reviewing it for conformance to our criteria and hopefully at some point design guidelines. And it either conforms to those or not, but they're not completely re-envisioning the project.
Right, and I would assume that if you thought that a project was going to be very controversial, and you probably have a sense of that early on, that you would bring it to some kind of joint study session.
Correct.
And the other is a question for Jim Priest, if you're here.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, the question is, for something that, is it possible to call this one application? That it's a development permit with design review? Can we make it one process, where there are other times where all you need is a design review permit or a different permit because it's only going to the AAC?
I'm so sorry, Madam Chair. You cut out for a little bit there. Could you repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
I'm trying to see if we can actually streamline. I mean, I know it's going to come in one application form, but is it possible to have it be one permit where it's got two pieces to it? And with the things that design, where AAC only reviews it, it's a different permit.
I think that may be a challenge to make it all one permit reviewed by two separate bodies. I know I've discussed this with staff, and I tend to agree with staff that we could administratively make it one application, one set of paperwork.
Mirabelle, somebody has their speaker on. If you could mute yourself. Go ahead, Jim.
I'm sorry. Yes. I think it would be more appropriate to have it as two separate permits if two separate bodies are reviewing those particular elements. I know I'd spoken with staff about this, and the idea of administratively making the paperwork as close to one application. We could have one document that applies for both the development permit and for architectural review. However, I think we'd have to go back and do a rethink on this if we were to do this as one permit reviewed by two bodies and how we would line up that relationship.
What do other cities do?
Typically, it would be modeled along these lines, that if you're going to separate architectural review and site development in this way and have two different bodies, that you do have two separate permits. Yes.
Yeah, and Chair Wormack, based on my research, typically they have two separate applications. They consider them to be discrete applications. But again, as Mr. Priestis said, administratively, we can make it look like one to the applicant. So they're filing one application form and paying one fee.
And if they're only going to AAC as one of the items that we've sent to them for AAC, they will pay a smaller fee?
Correct.
Good.
Correct.
I think those are my questions. Are there any other questions of staff? Do we have, Flynn, have you gotten a sense of the body? Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Lewin, I didn't see your hand earlier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I didn't have this question until I heard your thoughts and comments. So I guess, Flynn, if you could just answer, I guess, the simple question of what would we do as the Planning Commission if we thought that the architecture was just awful? In other words, the footprint was fine and the use was fine, but what if personally we thought it was terrible? What would our role be at that point?
So your role, as we've discussed, is you could offer comments to the AAC. So what you might do as you review a project, you might say that it conforms to the criteria for approval of a site development plan. However, it appears that it may not conform to the criteria for architectural review for this reason and that reason. It's not compatible with adjacent properties or something along those lines in terms of the colors and materials or things like that. So you as the Planning Commission can offer comments to the AAC. Another thing to take into consideration is the pre-submittal conference with staff. Having a staff person with architectural background, they would hopefully make those comments and request those changes up front. That's another key component of this process, is having a staff person do that work so you don't have to. So that's how we would address those issues.
So Flynn, I understand that. And I love the pre-submittal process. I do. I'm really kind of asking this weird thing, because if we don't like the architecture, but it goes to the AAC, we say that, you know, the use and everything else conforms. And the idea is the AAC can really only work around the edges. They can't deny it because they have to, it can't be substantially different from what was turned into us. How do we resolve that little paradox there?
So if the architecture is inadequate, again, you all as the Planning Commission could make that comment to the AAC. It would then become the AAC's responsibility to review the application for conformance to our architectural criteria. They may find that it doesn't meet those criteria and either deny the application, the architectural review application, at which point the applicant would have to come back with their architectural review application. They could redesign to conform to the criteria, and that's how AAC would handle it. So it would really fall upon the responsibility where the architecture is inadequate for the AAC to review it under their portion of the application process.
Okay, I think I hear you now. We could say, we're going to push this forward, but we think the architecture is not good enough. And when it goes to AAC, if they agree the architecture is not good enough, they either get denied or they resubmit. And okay, I understand. Thank you. And Madam Chair, that's what the conundrum started to develop in my head when you started to talk. So I think I understand now. Thank you.
Or Commissioner Hirschbein, couldn't we turn it down?
That was going to be my question.
Because I would think, I mean, I think
If
when
it's that bad, why wouldn't we just turn it down?
What would be the criteria for turning it down?
Harmony.
Not compatible with the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think your criteria gives us a couple of categories there that we could refer to in turning it down.
I'll just caution you to be careful in terms of the overlap of responsibilities.
But
Well, I haven't seen Commissioner Lewin's project, but I'm just thinking certain things in my mind. You know, I'm coming up with images, and we've certainly, Planning Commission over the years has certainly seen projects that might succeed on a site planning criteria, but fail on an architectural criteria with massing and adjacencies and circulation and all those kind of things. So I'm thinking that the criteria that you presented would allow us that discretion.
I think we have to have that discretion.
Well, then you're doing architectural review, if I'm understanding your question.
But architectural review is materials, site details.
So can I give you a specific example? It's way in the past.
Please.
Okay, so the project adjacent to the Regal Theater, as a site plan, it seemed to work. I mean, there were shops facing Tockwitz, and there was parking, and you can get from the parking to the restaurants, and it was a nice symbiotic relationship with the theater, et cetera. But it just was horrendously out of scale, and it just looked. I mean, to be kind, it looked silly. And I could point to a few criteria on your early screen there that I could use in denying that.
With that example, that is very helpful because that helps to kind of focus what the issue is. In criterion number 3 of your site design, you're looking at context. Is the project compatible with context? And in that specific instance, do the new buildings, are they contextually appropriate with the existing buildings in terms of massing and so forth? In that case, you would not be able to make that finding because you found them to be out of scale with the adjacent buildings. So under that criterion, that would give you the ability to deny the project, the site permit, the site development permit. So in that specific instance, yeah, I think you would have the ability under the criteria relative to the massing and the criteria that are available under the development permit.
Okay, but let me just ask another question. So let's assume that the process unfolds like you're describing it, where we send it to AAC and saying, just fix it. Do we get to see it again, or that's it? They fix it and we're done?
They fix it.
Yeah, they fix it and they're done.
Okay.
If the one thing that I saw was when the developer didn't like their fixes, and there was only one appeal that I remember in Santa Monica from what had been done by our architectural review group. It came back to the Planning Commission because the developer didn't like what they had suggested.
So that was an appeal.
That was an appeal, and that's the one time that it came back. Speaking to this, Flynn, I can think of 3 times that we really didn't like something and AAC didn't like something, and they turned it down unanimously, and it came to planning and we turned it down unanimously. The Rowan was the early version, the first version of the Rowan was similar to that. I think that project next to the theater, and we turned down the condo project for different reasons. I think we have had a similar aesthetic when we both thought something absolutely didn't work. Although we fixed them in different ways. But I do think that there has to be some room for, I think the planning the role of the AAC has to be a little more limited in terms of not absolute control over all of the architecture. And I don't want it to come back to us, but I want to be able to know that we've approved a building, not just massing.
Yeah, and again, because you're seeing the same application materials, you are essentially approving the project.
I mean, hopefully, if we had something where we said this is absolutely awful, we wouldn't be doing an approval and sending it on to them.
Yeah.
I mean, Commissioner Moon, I think I can't imagine that we would do that.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Irvin has a comment or question.
Commissioner Irvin, sorry.
It's okay. So, Flynn, with the comments you made about we need to be careful with denying, you gave a situation of where the massing. Can you give us another situation to where we wouldn't be able to find the findings to deny this project?
If you're starting to get into architectural details, like, for example, you are concerned about the colors that are being proposed, that may come to context too. Apparently, I've given you quite a broad range of discretionary items to look at in terms of that. But again, trying to keep the responsibilities separate, that architectural review is what the AAC's responsibility is in terms of placement of the landscape materials, the selection of landscape materials, colors, materials, fenestration, details like that. We want to make sure that they have the ability to make those decisions and can do that. At the same time, we want to be very careful that we don't give them full rein, that they're making changes to the project. We don't want that to happen either. So the comment of Chair Wormuck about Planning Commission should be able to approve the project. Yes, the answer is yes, you should be able to approve the project. And so apparently, just in listening to myself talk, we've given you enough tools to be able to do that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Madam Chair, could I just ask a quick question? I wanted to run something by the director really quick. Flynn, would it be a fair characterization to say that the development permit process here is like sort of the big picture, large items where architecture could, if it's a significant enough that it causes major height problems, massing problems, setback problems, those type of things, that would be a basis to deny by the Planning Commission. But really the architectural review is more of a fine-tuning type thing where perhaps the Planning Commission would not be opining upon small color variations, small architectural or medium treatments, stuff that does not rise to a very large site type level. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, I think so. Again, as we've discussed this through and looked at a couple of different scenarios, I would agree with that.
And with the number of applications the Planning Commission and the Architectural Review Commission will ultimately hear, I think there's necessarily going to be a little bit of overlap between the two. And I think it's a matter of degree and scale more than anything. My thoughts.
And again, we'll be able to fine tune this process as we see it work. We'll discover, are there any loopholes that we didn't think of? Is there anything that we didn't address in the ordinance that we have the ability to come back and make those corrections if we feel that it's not working in the way that we had intended?
Flynn, I'm thinking of, just to comment, the Orchid Tree Inn or hotel, I'm not sure, the Orchid Tree project. We left some items open in that when it went to council. I think we had concerns about some fencing, some treatments on that project. Those are the kinds of things where the wall, the way it curved, other things that we would Planning Commission would necessarily want to leave to the architecture group, even though it will impact the look of the project, but it really needed their eye.
Yeah, and that's again, something you can leave to their discretion if you choose to do so.
Right. What do you need us to do?
What I need is a motion. I've noted at least one correction to the criteria for architectural review, removing review of massing from that, leaving that responsibility with the Planning Commission. I believe that is really the only significant change to the draft ordinance that we need to make as the Planning Commission. One of the things I would ask you to do is to make a recommendation on the issue of tentative maps. Even though I don't have that as part of your materials with you, City Council would like to know your thoughts on making that amendment to the municipal code. So I would request your action on having Planning Commission be the final authority on tentative maps as well.
So a couple of things, and let me try and see if I can pull a motion together. One is an approval to send this on with the change on massing, with the couple of changes on giving trailer, I think it was trailer parks to the Planning Commission. That was one of the things, the suggestions and corrections that came out of AAC. The other one is that in a development plan, that the Planning Commission is approving the project. Some form of saying that we're not just approving massing and criteria, but we're basically giving entitlements. So we're giving approval to the project as it's been presented to us with suggestions. And then on the tentative map, I would make the recommendation that the tentative map stops at the Planning Commission has that approval, and always the case that the City Council can take it up on appeal if they don't like what we've done, but that would happen at Planning Commission. And a recommendation that as soon as possible, the electronic application follows as an implementation measure. Does that capture most of the comments that we've had? Paul, are you satisfied with that?
Yes. Did you include the advice on the tentative track map decision?
Yes.
Lynn wanted?
Yeah.
I think I understand what we're doing here, and I think you guys have worked hard. We won't know till it's done, if it works out, right? I'll support your motion.
Okay, I've got a motion. Are you a second?
I'll be a second, absolutely, Madam Chair.
Okay, are there any other corrections to that motion? And to include in that, as we implement it, offering to have liaisons go both ways. So people, there's some rotation of sitting in.
So noted.
Without that necessarily being in, that's our intention. Flynn, do you think this ends the process of having joint subcommittees when things need to get resolved?
No, we would still be able to have both bodies work together.
Okay. So that's a motion, my motion. Commissioner Lewin seconded it. Are there any other comments? Can we have a vote on it?
I have a comment.
Oh, Commissioner Song.
Yeah, I want to appreciate. I want to verbally say how much I appreciate the director's work putting together. Also, the calling it the development application. I think it's a wholesome word that includes really the whole essence of having the Planning Commission review the site and then the issues with zoning and general plan. So it really puts it well together. So thank you.
Thank you, yes. Yeah, so if you do the roll call, please.
Chair Wormuth,
Yes.
Commissioner Lewin,
Yes.
Commissioner Irvin,
Yes.
Commissioner Hirschbein,
Yes.
Commissioner Song,
Yes.
Vice Chair Maruzzi.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously. And moving right along, it's 7 o'clock. Does anyone need a break for a moment? Seeing no one who's indicated they want a break, we will move on to item 5, which is housing opportunities. And this is before the commission. The commission wanted to discuss this. We sent along some materials that have gone to council recently, so people would get a sense of the arena issues. Flynn, do you, as we talk about this, I think it's important to talk about it in the context first of the general plan update on the housing element.
Yeah, absolutely. Madam Chair, what I'd like to do is turn the time over to Assistant Director Newell, who will talk about the housing element in addition to the reports that were provided to you. And so if you wouldn't mind, I'll go ahead and turn it over to him right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, Madam Chair and Commissioners, we could actually combine both 5B and 5A if it makes sense, because they really are kind of an integral topic. I was just going to do a brief presentation and turn it back to the commission if we were to separate the two items. But if you don't mind, I probably would prefer to kind of just talk about both of the items because they are really important to discuss together. So if the commission's okay with that, I'll start the presentation on the general plan update because it does have some context as to where we're at right now with the housing element, the numbers that we gave you in the memorandum related to item 5A. Obviously, you can see in that memo, the city's current fifth cycle housing element had 272 total units that were necessary for the 8-year period that ends at the end of this year. Starting at the end of this year with the 6th cycle, we'll have over 2,500 units to plan for. So what I'll do is I'll make the presentation on what the status of our general plan is, and then we can have discussion on both housing opportunities as well as the status of the general plan. So let me pull that up here just a moment. Okay. So just some background as to what's been happening in the past few months. The steering committee, the general plan steering committee has met a couple of times since I think the commission has discussed the general plan update. And even before that, after the last item that the planning commission really had was the vision and priorities. And so that went to city council, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But related to the general plan steering committee, they met back in October to get an overview of the regional housing needs assessment allocation. So those numbers that I was just talking about with having to plan for over 2,500 units for all affordability levels. They looked at a potential housing candidate site, specifically along North Palm Canyon as a part of a revision to the land use plan for the city, for the update of the land use map, as well as the housing element. They reviewed some of the policy changes that are related to the plan development district language in our general plan currently, and also some changes to the residential definitions. And so they provided some direction to staff and the consultant as we as we've been looking at changes, making changes to the land use element and updating the housing element. So those things have been incorporated into the draft changes that we're looking at. We've also, the steering committee also met back in December, and they also looked at changes, some additional changes to the land use definitions as it relates to the mixed use and tourist resort commercial designations. So they've provided us some recommendations there. And then they also looked at administrative revisions to the land use map. So basically some cleanup items that have been necessary since the 2007 general plan was adopted. So they've looked at a number of things in the past it's been over a few months now, but they've been giving us direction on these items. And so with that direction, we've been updating the elements of the general plan. And just as a reminder, our general plan update, it's not a wholesale update. It really is administrative in nature. Obviously, where there's policy changes that we think are important for including to make our general plan current with today's times, we certainly want to incorporate that. But when we started this process over a year ago, the intent was we were looking at really making administrative changes, making sure our general plan was compliant with legislation that has passed since 2007 when the general plan was adopted. It was really focused in nature and really limited to certain chapters of our general plan. So again, with the information and the presentations that we've been having, it's really been that has been that has been kept in mind when we've been looking at changes and updates to the document. As I mentioned, the vision and priorities were reviewed by City Council, as you'll recall, and they asked that we continue to do additional outreach on that. Since that October meeting, we've had meetings with the Chamber of Commerce, the Main Street Group, hotel general managers, and the Human Rights Commission. We've gotten some good feedback on the long-term vision and priority statements from the general plan. So that, again, is still ongoing.
But they've stopped it, haven't they, David?
Yeah. I mean, as far as it's not happening right now at the moment, but we plan to do additional outreach. I guess what I meant was it's not finalized yet. So we plan to do additional outreach relative to the vision and priorities, but this is some of the outreach that we did more recently. So we also met with the council subcommittee. So that's council members Coors and Woods to discuss kind of the process and make sure that we're doing work based on their direction. And they've asked that we continue to work on our housing element to ensure that we are in compliance with state mandated deadlines. So what that's done is really required a separate timeline for the housing element from the rest of the general plan update. Yet that's because we do want to have more outreach, get more community input, especially at in-person meetings as much as possible, because we feel that would be more important, or that's extremely important for us to get community feedback on our general plan. So that would include our vision and priorities, as well as the land use circulation safety elements. So, in addition to the housing element, obviously we certainly want to make sure we get outreach and feedback on that document, but we certainly also want to make sure we get input where we can in person if available. So that's kind of been the direction. It's going to be a kind of a two-track time frame for one for the housing element and then the other for the rest of the general plan update. So related to the housing element timeline, we're going to have in the spring a community workshop. What we expect with that is, given our current state, we don't believe that we'll be able to do just an in-person meeting. So what we might do is have a kind of a hybrid approach if we can, but certainly if not, it would be an online workshop where we can get community feedback on the land use plan and the housing element. We'll also meet with the Affordable Housing Subcommittee to make sure that they agree with the direction that we're going with the housing element. And the Affordable Housing Subcommittee is comprised of the 2 council members. So that would be Councilmember Coors and Mayor Holstage. And then as we move that process along, we expect that the Planning Commission would review it in May and City Council would review the draft document in June, and really kind of give a blessing of the document and give us confirmation that we have we did prepare a document that reflects the community values. Before we submit it to the Department of Housing and Community Development, that's the state agency that reviews and approves housing elements throughout the state for all cities and counties. So before the October 15th deadline, we're required to have a 60-day review. So we envision that would be during the summer. And then after they get through the review and any changes that we might have to make based on their review, we would do a formal adoption in September with prior to submitting the final document by the October 15th statutory deadline. So that's just a kind of a brief overview of where we're at with the general plan. As it relates to the housing opportunity sites, so I do want to mention we have been working diligently on that part and that aspect of the housing element. As you may recall, when we did our first workshop back in February of last year, was an in-person workshop. We were able to have an in-person forum with community input, and we had stations that were set up. We had and we asked for feedback specifically for the chapters that we're updating. So for that land use element, the circulation element, the housing element. So we did ask for community feedback in that at that workshop. Since after the workshop, we've had a couple of surveys, one of which specifically addressed housing. So we have been taking that feedback as a part of our update to the housing element and the direction that we've been taking when looking at changes and updating the housing element. And then to go back to the discussion about the housing opportunities, and I know at the last meeting when we talked, or when the commission talked about looking at different areas of the city that might be appropriate. We certainly welcome any feedback the commission has. Our approach really has been to look at sites that are currently zoned for high density residential, medium density residential in the general plan, as well as zoning. And then from there, kind of look at other opportunities that we might see as a good fit for housing. So as I mentioned, there's a larger site along North Palm Canyon that the steering committee recommended be rezoned to allow specifically for residential. We're looking at the former COD campus location up off of North Indian as a change from the school designation that it currently is to a residential designation. And so kind of, as well as all the things that we have to deal with as far as constraints. So just natural constraints that we have. We have natural boundaries that we don't extend beyond because it's protected open space. Other issues that we look at are the airport. The Airport Land Use Commission has restrictions as it relates to development of land around the airport. So there definitely are some constraints with how much density you can put near the airport. So when we kind of factor all of these things in, we're kind of trying to put together a strategy to ensure that we do meet the numbers that the state is, I should say SCAG is given us for the 2,500 total units. So we have started to develop a strategy to address that, and we're getting close to the end of that. But again, we certainly are open to working with a subcommittee if the Planning Commission would like to establish that, or if they just want to directly provide comments to us as to sites that they've looked at that they've thought might be appropriate for housing. So that's really kind of the presentation that we want to give you on this this topic and the general plan update. And Madam Chair, I'll just turn it back to you.
Right. This meeting, can I just ask a question first? Of the 272 units we had in the last RENA numbers, what did we achieve?
Well, we certainly met all of the above moderate numbers. So that was the 116. So that was certainly met during the current cycle. As far as the low and extremely low, I'm not sure we met very many, if any, during that time frame. We did have some moderate that was built. So some of the fourplexes that were built helped us achieve those numbers recently. But yeah, we haven't really had a whole lot. But a lot of that has been stemmed from the loss of the redevelopment agency. So with the, as you know, the loss of that and the assistance that helped the city with meeting or attracting low and affordable housing projects has really impacted us.
And then a question, projects that were previously entitled, maybe like the Cody Place, which weren't built out, do they count in this year's numbers? Do they count 20 years ago when they were entitled?
It's based on building permits. So whenever the building permit has been issued or certificate of occupancy. So it wouldn't be based on the entitlement. So for instance, like the Chalk project on North Indian, that project was entitled during this current cycle, but that project, we don't expect would be built in this cycle. We expect them to be built next cycle.
Serena Park or what's left in Miralon, what's left in Asina, those would count in our next cycle. Am I correct with that?
Correct.
What's left of Cody Place, the other. So why don't I open this up? I know that people have had concerns and interests, and one of the thoughts was implementation, working on implementing the plan when it comes along. The commission might be able to do something like working with student architects to develop a plan to put housing on some of our, I'm not sure, commercial centers, working to help implement. They might be able to work to help implement, to gather information on putting together a tiny home park. And some of the things that you're not thinking about, like looking at areas of the city that could be rezoned to a higher density, like the north end of town, which used to be R2 and then got zoned down to R1, but might like to have the ability to build duplexes and fourplexes on some of the lots. So it's before you. I know Commissioner Lewin, you had interests, and I think helping Flynn implement this might be something that we can do. The question is, what do we want to do right now with they're pretty far along with the housing element, although I do think we actually need more public outreach on. We had the least ideas on the goals for housing of any of the topics that we dealt with. So throwing that out, I'm going to throw it to you, Commissioner Loon, and then hear from you guys in terms of what you'd like to do.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, David, Mr. Newell, for your presentation. I think it's good that 5A and 5B were kind of brought together here, because it highlights for me what I want to share with everyone, and the reason why at the end of almost every meeting I've been raising this topic. There is a general plan update that is a process cities must go through. What I'm saying to you, my fellow commissioners, is I think we need to do something different. That process has to go on. And Kathy and Flynn and David, they're doing everything right. What I want to talk to each of you about is the fact that we've got a housing crisis in Palm Springs. We've got a housing crisis in the whole state of California. And the truth is, it costs so much money to rent a home in Palm Springs. The people that work here cannot live here anymore. And in fact, if you want to buy a house, if you don't already own a house in Palm Springs, you probably can't afford the down payment on a house in Palm Springs. And so we are seeing now the effects of housing unaffordability, and that means people sleeping on the streets. And that's the visible sign of a problem in our community. But there's a hidden cost that we don't really see, and that's working families that can barely pay their rent and utilities month after month, and the generations of people that can't enter into home ownership. That's a kind of hidden cost that we can't see. So what's happening is the housing crisis is really becoming an economic trap for people because working people can't make ends meet. So the solution is not going to be for Palm Springs to start building subsidized housing. We don't have the money, we're not going to be able to. It's not going to meet the current housing needs. And we've got the RENA numbers that are telling us to add several thousand dwelling units. So what we have is a supply and demand problem. Prices are high because the demand is high, but the supply is very, very low. I think all of us as commissioners, we're seeing this. There's no apartment building applications coming across our desk. There's nothing on the horizon. There's no small condos coming across our desk. That's a zoning problem. The only things that are really coming to us are very expensive single-family home developments and even more expensive kind of exclusive hillside houses. And if we continue on this path, the problems will just get worse for our community. I think that we as a commission need to really lean into this today. We need to lean in and say, we're going to embrace this, not as a part of the general plan update process, which is very important, but really as a particular desire on our part to advise the city council that the time is now. We should bring in my personal opinion, a zoning consultant or an urban planning firm that really has strictly two jobs. Number one, identify the very best areas for where we can add 2,000 dwelling units. And number two, what should the mix of housing types be? Should they be single family, apartments, condominiums? There's a whole host of opportunities out there. If we can get that singular focus out of a consultant or a planning firm, we can work with staff then and the public to build a more sustainable and accessible housing market. And basically the private sector can solve this problem if we do the zoning right. And that's the conversation I'd like to have with the commission. And I'm really hoping that everyone will support this recommendation to council. And thank you very much, Madam Chair. Those are the thoughts I've been saving up for many months now.
Commissioner Hirschbein.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Lewin. I thought that was a very important thing to get out there. I've got a couple of just random thoughts, as I usually do. I think one of the things, I mean, I'm pretty certain about this, that's driving housing prices in Palm Springs, other than the fact that we're an incredibly desirable community to live in, is short-term vacation rentals. I think when you make a single family residence a cash cow, it takes it off the market for people that want to live there because it's so much more lucrative. And I know council loves short-term vacation rentals, but I think that's contributing to the affordability crisis. I don't know if you can peg a percentage to what that represents incrementally, but it's got to be something. It's got to be driving prices when an individual investor can buy a house, take it out of a residential use, and turn it into a short-term vacation rental that's making hundreds and hundreds of dollars a night. It's just common sense that it's driving prices up. That's one thing. The other thing, going back years when we were approving or reviewing a lot of these very large projects like Serena Park, we had discussions about jurisdictions that required a certain percentage of affordable housing for approvals. And we were told we don't have the mechanism for that. It's very complicated. There's no organization that can take possession of those or can manage those. I think the time is right to re-examine that and implement some sort of affordable housing requirement for subdivisions or condo projects or apartments that we approve moving forward. So those are two thoughts. And then the other one is, if you look at where affordable housing projects have recently been approved and where they've been built historically, they're all in the north part of the city. And there's got to be some effort to disperse affordable housing throughout the community, and make it more interwoven into the whole city fabric instead of not isolating, but congregating those levels of housing costs in a particular area of the city. It's just not, I don't think it's sustainable. I think in the long term, it's going to lead to bigger problems. I think integrating affordable housing throughout the city would be a really important goal. So those are my thoughts on that.
Commissioner Irvin.
I would definitely agree with Paul's sentiment, and also with what Commissioner Hirschbein said. It sounds like both of them are the same, and I think that what Paul said kind of it's a little bit bigger than what we're able to handle, and so having someone in specifically to help us and guide us in that direction would be something that's very important, because I mean, we all have ideas of things that we want to do, but a firm coming in specifically giving us direction would definitely help. The question I have for you as well, Mr. Newell, is that you mentioned the project that's college specific that's going to be changing. Is that anywhere in the extreme low to very low at all? Because that area seems to be ignored quite a bit, and then more towards the higher end of the above moderate and moderate. Is that project, I mean, will that change that happens out there? Will that be for low income or extreme low? Or will that once again be another project of what's going on now, where everyone's grabbing the money and creating expensive projects?
Certainly, yeah, good question. So that site, the steering committee did have a recommendation that site be upzoned to a medium density or a higher density residential. We do know that the owner is probably looking to do a lower density project. We haven't received a formal application yet. So that will certainly be a topic that will be discussed as the housing element moves forward.
So it would fall into the bringing housing to the very low or extreme low situation, or more towards the moderate high end.
So for our housing element, how it works is when we designate property, or we have to make certain assumptions in order for HCD to accept the housing element and the sites that we think can handle the city's RHNA numbers. So for each site, there's, it's either going to be, so here's how the basic kind of configuration of how that would work is single family zoning is usually considered above moderate. Medium density residential or high density residential is typically medium density is typically a moderate income level, and then the lower income levels are typically your high density designated sites, and so those would be 21 units to the acre, oftentimes. And so HCD looks at the zoning. They also look at the size of the site. Typically 2 acres is kind of the magic number that they look at a minimum 2 acres in order to achieve some of the lower income thresholds. So like I said, at this time we haven't defined that site specifically. We're looking at it as a part of probably the medium or the high density. It just depends on kind of where the numbers finally fall as we kind of pull together the strategy for addressing the arena numbers.
And how big is that college specific area there that's going to be available, or is going to be zoned, going to be changed?
It's 125 acres, if I recall right. I'm not sure if that's the specific number, but I think it's over 100 acres.
Okay, so we definitely, like I said before, I would definitely agree to lean in the direction of what Paul said, of having someone to come in and give us a vision and work with us specifically to bring some housing. And also, I love the point that Commissioner Hirschbein said also about mixing the uses and not just placing everything in one area and kind of flowing it together through our city. That's my comments.
Are affordable, actually, we have seen some of our affordable in different neighborhoods. I mean, we saw some of it in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city recently, the Agave project. But that's because the city had land and gave it as part of the project. That's an important thing to try and balance, but that probably comes with city housing dollars.
I don't recall anything on the south end though.
It's not south. There's nothing on the south. There are trailer parks on the south end, which are really the major affordable housing that we have in the city.
Yeah, but I mean, those have been there for decades.
Right. Well, we haven't built, I think the last, Flynn, you might know when the last affordable housing project was actually built. There's one after the DAP project in 2003, isn't there?
The Coyote Run projects, I'm not sure exactly when those were built.
Before the DAP project.
I think it was Rosa Park, North End,
Okay.
TBHC.
I will say this about one of the trailer parks on the south end of town, the Palm Canyon trailer park, which had a lot of vacant sites. They've been bringing in a lot of modular units, smaller modular units that are on the lower end of being affordable.
Well, and I don't think that that's part of the affordable housing. I think that's because I know someone that lives there and they're not under rent control. They can charge
they're
anything.
not under rent control, but if you look at the pricing of the units,
oh yeah,
they're affordable to those
but
who are working here in Palm Springs.
Right, but there's 2 parks that are.
And the Coyote Run and also the Rosa Gardens, that's more in the northern part of the town. That's not in the southern, the south part of the town.
And it depends on what you call north. The city has a RFP for the area that's next to Aldi's on Gene Autry. The site that they got from Westman Development, Westman's from Grit, which they're looking at. But that's not South End either. Maria?
So let's see. If I think about this in a practical way, is we have the land that is owned by the city, and they're zoned in a certain way. And I don't know if with those lands we have more flexibility to increase the density if we go through a public process and the public agrees to that. The second part is that we have private owned property in which we could have pretend a housing overlay in which we could increase the density. However, it would have to be motivated by the owner for them to want to build and be profitable for them to build high density housing. So I like the approach that is being proposed, but perhaps even before that, it's a preparation meeting with developers locally or in Southern California of what would motivate them to build more dense type of projects. If you look in LA, high density is 50 units to an acre. For Palm Springs is 20 units to the acre. So how do we change people's concept of density, height, number of stories, and the fact that you will still see the mountains, but there will be more density involved. So it's in some ways, what I would like to see is for the city-owned sites to be in front and to set up examples or models of what could be done, so that the private developers could be encouraged to do so, and change the model of, instead of being market rated housing, maybe is more medium or moderate or low income housing. But if we don't have an example of how to do it well, I think it will be difficult for private developers to be motivated to do it. I think certainly having a zoning overlay or a change of zone would help, but it's still about the dollars. It's still about what they want to do to have the greater profit. So the question is, can the city be ahead of with their property that they own and encourage that? I mean, they already have done that with Agave project, but is there other places sprinkled in the town of Palm Springs that we are able to do this and encourage? Because the land almost has to be sold for $1. And I don't know how many developers would actually, for-profit developers would actually do that in order to build affordable housing.
The one piece of land the city has is actually too close to the airport to allow the kind of density you're talking about, the one that's next to Aldi's and the school district.
And it's not zoned for residential currently. So we would have to go through, it's right now industrial or it would, we have R1 and then we have R2 and then we have R3. So how we jump from M to R3, I like to see how we can actually do that, through planning.
Where I live was originally industrial. It's still zoned industrial. It had a PD on top of it.
Right.
But to Commissioner Hirschbein's comments, I know that City Councilor Garner asked the city attorney for an inclusionary housing ordinance recently, which the city could do if it, which would mean that as things got built by the private sector, they would have to build some portion of affordable units as well, either on or off-site.
Commissioner Lewin had a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could I wasn't done. Could I just add one more? Sorry, Mr. Lewin. the fifth cycle compared to the sixth cycle, it's 9 times over. And it's in a span of 8 years or 9 years. Has anybody questioned how this could actually be doable? Or do we not question that we get the numbers and that's what we have to achieve? Or do we all know that we're only going to be able to achieve 10 to 20% of this? That was the question. Thank you.
I could probably answer that. The arena numbers it's an exercise that HCD requires. I don't believe they require the city to actually build it. They want the sites for, am I correct on that, Flynn?
Yes, you're correct. That we have to make the sites available through zoning for the development of housing in each of the categories. The city obviously is not expected to build the units, but we have to do everything we can through our policies and through our zoning to allow those to be built and to encourage those to be built. Going to the question if the numbers can be challenged, the answer is yes, there is a process you can go through with the regional agency, SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments. However, if we challenge the numbers, they'll have to come from somewhere else. So for example, here in the Coachella Valley, if we challenge our number, then those numbers will have to be made up by one of the other cities in the Coachella Valley, essentially. We actually have a much more bearable burden than some of the other cities do. Indio has significantly more units that they have to accommodate. Desert Hot Springs also has a significantly higher number of units that they have to accommodate. So while it seems that it's an excessive burden for the city of Palm Springs looking at the available land we have available, comparatively, it's not as much of an issue for us as it would be for some of the other jurisdictions and the numbers that they've been given.
So going back to Commissioner Lewin, Maria, if I can, your suggestion was that we figure out a way to implement this to help things actually get built. Am I correct?
Yes, and to have a number that is achievable. But I understand that what is being said is that through zoning that this could be, regardless if it is private or public, that through zoning in the city of Palm Springs, this many units could be achievable or entitled.
I'm going back to Commissioner Lewin's initial comments. You were talking about trying to figure out a way to implement it so that something could actually be built. Am I correct?
No, Madam Chair, what I'm suggesting, sorry, I've got an echo going on here, and I apologize, I've got a cold, so I'm a little bit trouble speaking. What I'm saying is you can take the RENA numbers, you can take the definitions of affordable housing, you can take all of these things. That's a process. We as a commission, I think, we need to lean in right now. This is the time to be intentional. That's why my suggestion is we hire a zoning consultant to advise us, the Planning Commission, on where we can place all of these dwelling units, not rely on undeveloped land on the fringes of our city, but really start to look at where can we increase density, make housing available and more accessible. If you see that there is a structural imbalance right now, there is a structural problem. We need to change the underlying zoning in significant portions of the city to allow for the private sector to say, oh, hey, this land that I used to just think was a single lot home, I can now put 10 or 12 units here. That's where the opportunity comes from. And that individual landowner, they may not build it, but they may sell it to someone else who does build it. We have to kind of unleash the floodgates and address the pent-up demand that exists. That's what's causing the unaffordability problem. So in my mind, if you look at Los Angeles, The renaissance of downtown LA came about because the city decided to rezone its office buildings and allow for residential uses in downtown LA. And with that, it didn't require giant subsidies. With that came private sector developers that said, you know what, we can now take these old buildings that are abandoned and turn them into beautiful lofts. The same thing happened in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley. It was all single family homes. I'm not suggesting that we destroy our beautiful neighborhoods of Palm Springs, but Los Angeles did in fact rezone huge portions of the San Fernando Valley, and that what followed from there was higher density. What we have the opportunity to do today is to say, we see this problem and we're not going to wait for it to get worse. We're going to lean in. We're going to make it more equitable. We're going to make it more diverse. We're going to be more inclusive, all the things we believe in. We're going to do it with intentionality. And we're going to bring in someone from the outside to help us, because all of us are way too close to how things have always been. We're just so conditioned to know that that's the place where that thing is supposed to be. And I'm saying, let's take a fresh look. Let's bring in an outside perspective and see where we can put those 2,000 or 2,500 units or 5,000. We might just do something amazing. That's what I'm hoping you guys will join me in. Let's do something amazing. Thank you.
Yes, please, go ahead.
You know, in the middle of our city, we have Section 14, which has an awful lot of available land. What is the tribe's commitment to this sixth cycle? I want to know what the tribe's responsibility is, if any, interest in, if any, to solving this issue. Does anyone have a thought about that? Director Fagg?
I can speak to that, Madam Chair and Mr. Vice Chair. So we have drafted our initial map with the sites that we know are zoned appropriately, including the sites that we are looking at for rezoning and changing the density. And some of those sites are in Section 14. So we are looking at Section 14 because it does have available land that is zoned for higher density as meeting our numbers, to meet our numbers.
But what is the tribe's, do we know what the tribe's interest in that is in this, meeting these numbers?
I don't think they have any concern as long as, you know, they're not restricted from developing a product that's otherwise allowed in the Section 14 plan. The challenge then becomes if we say, okay, this site X is zoned for high density residential. And in our housing element, we said this site would be appropriately, you know, it's appropriate, it's 2 acres in size for an apartment building that, you know, could help us meet our low or our very low income numbers. And then a project comes in that's, you know, single family development, which could be the case under the Section 14 plan. And then it gets approved. We can't deny the project under state law, but once that happens and that site is no longer, you know, being used for that, what we categorize as an apartment site, we have to find another site in the city to meet those numbers again within 6 months. And that's based on state law having a no net loss requirement of your housing numbers or sites for your housing numbers.
What I'm asking is regarding, what's that?
The tribe is not subject to the regional housing needs assessment numbers. So they are exempt from that process. They don't share the same responsibility that we as the city of Palm Springs do in terms of identifying and making provisions for housing.
So do we reach out to them anyway, just to see if they would be interested in doing that?
Yes, as Mr. Newell has indicated, we already have met with the tribe and looked at the potential for sites within Section 14.
Wouldn't it be a lot of sites within Section 14? I mean, what needs to happen? Does large portions of the open land there need to be rezoned for multifamily? Is that what needs to happen, or what are the steps that need to happen in Section 14 since there's so much land there?
Yeah, section 14 is already one of the higher intensity or higher density designated areas of the city. So it does already currently allow for some of those higher numbers per acre. And obviously, because it's undeveloped, those sites obviously are potential candidates for meeting our numbers. So yeah, as I mentioned, we are certainly looking at those sites as a part of our analysis for meeting these numbers.
Is one of the problems with section 14 in that the city or affordable housing agencies and organizations aren't able to contribute, or the tribe doesn't want money to help develop these pieces of land? In other words, let's look at the Chalk site, right? This is San Rafael and Indian. The city has put in some serious resources there to have that built. Is that right?
Correct.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
But that wouldn't occur in section 14. Is that the case?
That site is a city-owned site. A lot of the property in section 14 is owned by an Alati or different Alati members of the tribe.
Right. So what I'm driving at is, obviously we're not going to solve this here, but the tools that exist where there's other agencies that Kathy worked with, knows about in terms of funding for affordable housing, do those apply to the open land that's in section 14, or is it because it's owned by the tribe and or it's Alatis? That's really not going to happen. So therefore there won't be an incentive for a private developer to come forward because they're going to have to fund it all themselves.
No, I think affordable housing could happen in any place that there's proximity to transit. You need proximity to transit for most of the funders, and proximity to medical and to grocery stores. So some sites become like hillside sites become undevelopable because they're too far away from transit.
Right, but that's not an issue in section 14. Right. There's a lot of...
No, section 14 would qualify. The real question is, would the Alatis sell it? And two, can the developers afford to buy it and pay prevailing prices for land with everything else that they need to put together in the way of money?
That's the question I have.
And it's basically when you're sometimes assembling, you could assemble I'm sure there's more that you could assemble, but 10, 12 funding sources. You may not be able to get enough money for to buy the most expensive land. If you could buy it, I'm sure you could also lease it, but you would be paying a lease payment every year, and you might not be able to afford that. You could do probably a 60-year lease. It's all doable for affordable housing. It's just that the cost of the land makes it more likely that you're going to get a market rate developer doing it.
So back to the thoughts that we were having, is it going to require then that any affordable housing project that moves forward in the city has to be on city-owned land?
It has to be, any affordable housing project has to be financially viable.
Right. Well, that's a large term, but
it doesn't necessarily mean city-owned land, but it means you have to be able to afford buying it. You know, a gift of land always makes it easier.
Are there any examples of projects that are in the future that we know of that are affordable that are not on any city-owned land, a private parcel?
The DAP, I still want to call it Desert AIDS Project, but it's
Vista 2?
DAP campus.
Is it the Vista 2? What do you call it?
Yeah, the DAP project is something that DAP bought I'm assuming they bought a building and they've converted that building or land into space for housing. They expanded their campus. That was through donations, through grants or other money.
So going back to what Commissioner Lewin was talking about, I'm sorry, were you not finished?
I mean, a nonprofit could donate the land. Churches sometimes have taken land that's adjacent to them and used it for affordable housing. I mean, there are a lot of things like that that have happened. It's just, building affordable housing, it's the mechanisms we have are probably some of the most expensive to use, and the worst that you could possibly use, but the best we have. The tax credit program is really difficult.
So going back to what Commissioner Lewin was saying, is there an issue, maybe I'm unaware of it, where we have lots of sections of the city, lots of areas in the city that need to be rezoned for higher density? Is that a problem here? I'm
sure that we could rezone areas for higher density if the populace.
I don't know. And that's what I'm asking. And Commissioner Lewin, maybe you have an answer. I don't know.
And maybe it's Flynn that could answer that too.
Madam Chair, can I address the question directly?
Yep.
Madam Commissioner Maruzzi, it is my opinion, it is just my personal opinion that yes, there is land in the city that could benefit from being rezoned to have more density. And I think that's the fundamental problem that we need help addressing. That is, we as commissioners are not going to figure it out. That's why having someone come in and say, hey, these are your opportunities. Here's your opportunities. Now let's make some decisions. That's where I'm going with this.
But I mean, how much land is there, which we're even talking about? If we looked at a map, is there that much land left other than Section 14?
Commissioner Maruzzi, I think we need to look at land that's already been built on and rezoning that as well. It doesn't have to be virgin land. And that's where you see what I'm saying? We can be too close to the problem. Sometimes we need to rezone existing land that might already have structures on it and allow for greater density and development.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So piggyback, I have three questions. One is the current amendment, general plan amendment process that is going through is identifying areas or in which a 543 affordable housing could be built. Is that the exercise that the amendment is going through right now? That's
We're
one.
going through a process of identifying areas where 2,557 units could be built right now.
And that's with the help of the planning consultant.
We have a consultant working on that.
Okay. So the second question is that, which I fully support Commissioner Lewin, but I'm trying to see how it could be productive. If we have this sort of brain hair idea of another planning consultant coming in and saying, oh, consider these areas, consider that area, does that create a opening of minds and help open the gates of more flexible zoning and planning? Or does it make it confusing because you're in the process of amending the general plan right now?
I think it probably could make it a little bit confusing because we're doing the housing element right now.
Okay, and then the third question is, in another way of looking at this, could the zoning, could the density be higher density? Could the change of density be considered, could the density be changed to a higher density with our current housing element?
I think you could, I mean, we did something when I was in Santa Monica. We changed the entire downtown, let it go up to 6 stories, as long as the units were rental and they were rented at 100, at or below, I think 100% or 120% of median.
Right, and Kathy, I know you know this, with affordable housing, you have incentives, 35% housing.
There are no incentives on that. It was allowing people 4 more stories of height.
Right, but there is this movement from Senate bills in wanting to increase that 35% incentive to even 50 or 100% in order to encourage.
You can do that. There's incentives for low-income housing. You could also create incentives. I think the most difficult housing to build is actually the moderate range, the 81 to 120, because there are no subsidies for that. So you'd have to do all of that with density adjustments. Commissioner, I've got other people who, Commissioner Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I recognize that I might be thinking on a level that might be different from some of my fellow commissioners. So I'd like to share a personal experience, if I could. The state of California has certain environmental guidelines, right, on sustainability. And the city of Palm Springs has to comply with the state of California's guidelines on sustainability. That's kind of what we're doing with the housing element of the general plan right now. We're going to comply with something. But the city of Palm Springs many years ago decided it wanted to have its own sustainability commission. And I was on that original commission, and we sat there and struggled for months and months and months, not sure of what to do and how to do it. We all had good hearts and good intentions, but we didn't know how to have the rubber hit the road. And finally, the city council stepped in and said, you know what? We're going to hire a consultant for you. You're going to put together a document that we can digest and vote on. And they hired somebody by the name of Kay Hazen, who came in and took tons of ideas and looked at best practices from many, many cities and municipalities. We came with a document that was the path to sustainability. And as a result of that, the city of Palm Springs has gone from being a city that complies with regular efficiency updates from the state of California to a city that is intentional with its behaviors. It has embraced sustainability, and it has done things far beyond what the state mandates. That's what I'm trying to communicate to you, each of you, my fellow colleagues here, is that I think that's what's needed now, is for us to go beyond compliance and become visionary and bring in some help and say, what can we do that's truly amazing? And that's why in my mind, it doesn't conflict with what David is doing, so important work on the housing element. That needs to be done. But there can be something else that's also done, which is a whole new vision altogether, that sees opportunity up and down the Sunrise Corridor, that maybe envisions high rises along I-10. I don't know what it is, but I think there's a way to really do something different without messing up the great work that the planning department is currently doing, but really reflects the vision that we collectively have and the citizens have, and it's a whole other process. Does that help at all, Commissioner Song? Or does it make it worse?
Of course it helps. The issue is, I think this may require more time and more discussion, because in order for a consultant to be brought, they need to understand what the scope is. And so what is the scope, and who's going to help us define the scope? I think a general scope of saying, help us find housing opportunities so we can have more opportunity for different citizens of different income level is too broad. I think we need more structure and more discussion so that we can be better direction on what is the goal we want to achieve, and also that it does not conflict with the general the housing element update. So in it, for example, I think there needs to be more discussions of what is it that we would like to achieve. What will the public be able to join our journey and be educated and be able to understand that in order to live in Palm Springs, we all need to make sacrifices. I don't know what that is, but I think I would like a little more planning before we can bring somebody and ask them to be to contribute to our expansion of how we can think about be more inclusive with people who live in Palm Springs.
Madam Chair, if I could just jump in listening to some clarification from Commissioner Lewin in terms of what he envisions happening. I see with the housing element and the regional housing need assessment of 2,500 units that we have to accommodate, the state is very rigid in terms of where they will allow those units to be. It has to be undeveloped land, has to be at least 2 acres in size, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And our housing element will address what the state wants to see. What Commissioner Lewin is saying, as I understand it, is there are other ways for us to achieve the goals that aren't within that rigid pattern that the state has established. And so I really see this as being a companion effort, if you will, to what we are doing with the housing element. And in other ways, I see it as helping to implement the policies that I'm imagining we will have in the housing element that talk about looking at other opportunities for allowing the development of housing in areas where we wouldn't, where we don't currently see it. So I see it as being an alternate method to achieving the goals and policies of the housing element by looking outside of the rigid limitations that the state will accept. That's kind of how I see the problem being presented, if you will. One of the things I want to say is we don't want to confuse one effort with the other, that we are looking to get public input on the housing element. We need to do that. That's very critical and important. But we will also want to get public input on this effort that Commissioner Lewin is talking about. We don't want one to take away from the other. And I think we have to be very careful as we look at how we might do this, is to make sure that we don't cannibalize what's already happening with the housing element while still wanting to support the look at alternate sites. Just one more thought to toss out there, and Chair Wormack, you've already mentioned this, is one of the things that we haven't really done over the last couple of years is engage the educational sector, and I'm specifically thinking of architectural schools, Cal Poly Pomona, College of the Desert, in helping us to look at opportunities. One of the thoughts that I had when Commissioner Lewin first brought this up is, couldn't we engage students to look at some of our existing sites? And I think of some of our existing shopping centers where there are pad sites, or maybe there's the opportunity for doing something that is multi-stories by bringing housing into those commercial sites. It would be interesting to see if we turn this loose to a student architecture group to see what they might come up with. And so I think there are some opportunities that we could utilize students to help us think outside of this narrow structure that we currently have. So just another thought to bring into the equation.
Madam Chair, can I just thank Flynn for making my point so much better than I obviously made it? Thank you for explaining. He's exactly right. It's a parallel process and we shouldn't cannibalize what's going on. And thank you for clarifying that, Flynn. I really appreciate how you said it.
Commissioner Marucci.
Just to clarify, if we were to engage either a consultant and or students in the architectural schools and so forth, would it be necessary to involve the general public at this point? I mean, why couldn't it be our own process and then at some point we then present it to the public? Because I don't want it to get all mixed up with, everybody has an opinion about, where something could go and, oh yeah, I don't want to have anything on a shopping center because it's not enough parking. We need to have some freedom of thought. I would actually recommend that we don't have the public involved at this stage if we're going to move forward, at least to get some ideas out there. Because I very much support what Commissioner Lewin is saying. I think it's an excellent idea and I very much want to be part of it. So that's just my thought. Let's try to at least get the ideas out there first and before we bring in the public.
Again, I've seen that kind of thinking result in a whole 10 square blocks turn into an apartment district when it was once 1 to 2 stories by doing some changes. But can I turn this over to a subcommittee to think a little more about it and bring it back for more discussion? If I appointed Commissioner Song and Commissioner Lewin, is there anybody else that wants to work on this? Commissioner Irvin, I think we can only have 3 people in a subcommittee, am I correct? That's 50% of our group. Is that okay, Flynn?
Yes, 3 members of the Planning Commission is appropriate. We do anticipate that we'll have an additional member here shortly, so I don't think that's an issue.
So if I appoint the 3 of you to a subcommittee to think this through more and bring it back?
Oh, Commissioner Morrissey was also interested.
I'll let you work through how we've got 4 people interested. Flynn, we can't do that, can we? We're not working on projects.
No, we need to keep it limited to 3 members of the Planning Commission.
I could withdraw.
If we have it, Commissioner Maruzzi, Commissioner Irvin, and Commissioner Lewin. With Commissioner Lewin, do you want to chair the subcommittee?
Yes, Madam Chair. If you could explain to me what we're going to do as the subcommittee, what is our role?
Right now. Explore these ideas further. Bring something back. I mean, if your only suggestion is that we raise this to City Council because they'd have to pay for it, but to think through what we could do in this area, what work product we could be involved in.
I'd be happy to chair a subcommittee and work with any of the commissioners that would like to work on this. Could we have at least a month to come back to this commission then?
I would give you 2 months to come back.
Okay.
And if you need more time.
Will staff be able to answer some questions for us?
Staff will be able to support you in terms of setting up the Zoom meetings for the subcommittee, and will assist in whatever ways that we can. Please keep in mind there's a capacity. We have a number of projects that are underway right now, but again, we will assist to the degree that we are able to.
And I'm mindful of that, Flynn. That's part of my thinking here. I mean, I understand that.
Madam Chair, before
Yes.
you conclude discussion, we did have Ms. Nunez who had messaged me if you were open to having a question from her about this process.
Absolutely. Ms. Nunes, if you're there, if you would unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I think some of it you addressed, but I'm just hearing Mr. Flynn and then Mr. Lowen. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, mention just about, because there was questions about the zoning. And so I think with the housing element consultant, they could also play a role. And it's an outside, I presume, I don't know, consultant that could help with the zoning to address some of the RENA numbers. So I just wanted to kind of remind folks about that. And that when we can think of creative ways about how we address affordable housing, rezoning on density and mixed use. And that's why I had suggested too, that we have like an interactive map where whoever the consultant or whoever puts the opportunity zones. And that would allow us also as a community to look at it and be able to see what we can work with and suggest where there could be affordable housing, multiple density. We can make comments, things like that could be a good, productive, interactive way to engage with the community and give some good quality input in the process before, during, and after the housing element draft. Thank you.
I thought that Ms. Nunes had really good comments to increase the public participation in the in the housing element. I don't know if that's something that you can look at, David.
Yeah, we certainly can work with her, and wherever we can, we certainly welcome feedback from especially the stakeholders that are really out there doing that work.
I think it would be really helpful, and I think it would be good to figure out how we could do a little more outreach on the housing issues themselves.
And if you recall, you remember the steering committee did consider some items that were specifically related to changes to the policy of the land use definitions. So we are looking at, removing some of the barriers as it relates to PDs, making PDs as requirements, and encouraging and really incentivizing density for affordable housing projects. So we are certainly looking at that as far as the policy goes. And as I said, we're really getting close on the land use map and the vacant sites map to show where housing could go with the zoning.
And it might be good if it's interactive and people can comment on it. I think we should end this discussion and go to Planning Commissioner reports, requests, and comments.
Before you do that, Madam Chair, I think Commissioner Irvin, he had his hand up.
I'm sorry. Commissioner Irvin, you're muted.
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention that some of the communities are still having virtual Zooms conducting their community meetings. So, for input on communities, we should think about reaching out to some of these communities that are still conducting some of their normal monthly meetings.
That I think would be a really good idea. When we were doing the map, we had some meetings with the Latino community as well as the Filipino community and the Afro-American community. And those are communities that really do need housing. Some of them need it preserved and some of it need it expanded. So it would be good to touch base as well. I don't know if we've done any outreach with housing developers. I don't mean affordable, I also mean market rate.
No, we really haven't at this point.
It might, if it's possible to build any of that outreach into the housing element discussions, it might be, I know they're kind of what HCD wants is ossified, but the discussions themselves might help with the goals and the implementation.
And Madam Chair, just to wrap up this discussion, with the subcommittee members, Commissioner Lewin, Commissioner Irvin, Vice Chair Maruzzi, I'll contact you within the next day or two to look at your availability and put your first subcommittee meeting together. And so we'll try and be mindful of your work schedules and do this at a time when it's convenient for all of you to meet. So again, I'll be in contact with you.
Thank you all for bringing these issues to us. Are there any Planning Commissioner reports or requests? Commissioner Hirschbein.
I had a couple. Flynn, any news on the fulfillment center? Have they done any community outreach?
No, they haven't done any community outreach yet. We were in contact with them earlier today to see when they would like to come back to a study session of the Planning Commission. They weren't able to give us a date yet, so at this point in time, it's on hold. They did indicate that they do want to move forward and would do additional community outreach, but nothing has been established yet.
On the site on East Palm Canyon that is just east of the Rimrock Center, I noticed the whole site was cleared of vegetation. Is that a prelude to development, or is that something to do with flood zone, or do you know what's going on there?
David, you're nodding your head. It's part of the Line 41 project, which is a drainage project that's being conducted by Riverside County Flood Control. So they're preparing to put new storm drain in along the frontage of Highway 111 there.
Okay. And then I just had one other question, kind of comment. As part of the housing element or part of this process, I just suggest zeroing in on auxiliary dwelling units as well. And along that line, have we issued any permits for ADUs? And if so, how many have been built?
That is actually part of our strategy too, because the state does allow ADUs to satisfy the lower income, some of the lower income unit numbers that we have to meet. So that's part of the strategy. And what they look for as it relates to that is historically what has the city been approving. So for the most recent numbers that we have, just for, let's see, 2020, they've been increasing over the past couple of years. So trying to find this data here. Let's see. So in 2020, we had about 14 that included kitchens. We also had a number of casitas that were built.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot, but we are starting to receive more applications under the new ADU ordinance.
So I read an interesting article about Los Angeles. They've invited contractors in who build ADUs, and they pre-approved a unit. So I guess all the structural and all those things. And so their permitting process in the city of Los Angeles, which is amazing for these ADUs that are pre-approved, is 1 day. And I'm thinking that might really incentivize people to put these in if they don't have to go through a lengthy permitting process for these things.
Yeah, that's something that we have looked at. City of San Jose is also doing a similar program where they are pre-approving certain designs for ADUs, which makes the process much quicker and easier for applicants who choose to build them. It's something that we are investigating here, and hopefully we'll be able to roll out a program within the next 6 months or so.
That's great. Thank you. That's all I got. Thank you.
Well, quick question. What is ADUs?
So many times we use acronyms in planning and we don't explain what those acronyms stand for. ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. Essentially what it means is a separate living unit that is built on a single family property. It could either be attached or detached.
And the state right now has mandated that every jurisdiction allow them in single family zones.
There was the orchid tree was brought up. I'm just curious, what is this current status of the orchid tree? Does anyone know? The orchid tree project?
David, do you want to go ahead or should I?
My understanding is it's delayed. We haven't seen the last that I understand we've heard is that they've requested an extension for the time frame to still comply with the hotel incentive program that was approved, because at this point they should have already had building permits in process, if not through the process close soon. So COVID.
So just to give some additional information there, as you may be aware, the City Council established a performance schedule for the orchid tree property. They were supposed to have their building permits submitted in January. They failed to meet that deadline. Our office notified the city manager of that failure to meet the deadline. And so the city manager is in discussions with the applicant at this point in time.
Good. It's good to know that. I guess you can't use, I guess property owners can't use the excuse of COVID forever.
They've been allowed, have commercial developers been allowed to build during this period?
At this point in time, yes. That we're no longer restricted just to residential construction.
Something like the water park, just a question of where it is. I walked past it the other day and they had torn out the whole water area. And are they going ahead with construction, or they?
Yes, they are. They had been undergoing testing of the new wave equipment to make sure that it worked. And so with that testing being finished, they're now in the process of removing the existing pool structure and expanding the pool area in accordance with the approved plans. They're moving forward with phase 1 construction. They, I believe, have their phase 2 permits in process, if I remember correctly. But yes, they are moving forward, although obviously not as quickly as we would have liked them to.
And will they be in a position where they'll be open for the fall?
I don't know if they'll be able to make that deadline.
Is there any update on what's going on in the Parker expansion that we approved last year or the year before?
I had an email from the Parker team. They had indicated that they would be putting the development on hold for the next several months. They've been impacted by the pandemic, obviously. They had already submitted their building permits to us, and the permits were ready to issue. So they've already done all of that work, but again, they're waiting to see how the market rebounds before they pull those permits and actually begin construction.
Thank you.
And just a general question, how many of the projects that were approved have been delayed because of COVID? Has almost everything been delayed?
To a certain degree. The housing projects have been least impacted by COVID. As you see, the construction at Cody Place, that's moving forward. I understand that sales are good. Miralon, the developers that have been approved there have come close to selling out of the initial phases. We have Woodbridge Pacific that will be coming back to you to extend the phase at Miralon. So residential seems to be doing quite well in terms of sales. It's the commercial sector that has been impacted by COVID most severely. And so the commercial projects are the ones where we see delays.
And the downtown park, is that in your purview, or?
Yes, it is. It's being managed by the engineering division, which is part of development services. We do have a schedule for the park. It looks like it will be opening towards the end of August is the date that we currently have based on our director's performance.
That's great.
How exciting. Anything else, Flynn? Did you have any additional?
One of the things I'd like to put out there for the Planning Commission, Vice Chair Maruzzi always wants to know about the status of projects, and unfortunately I'm not able to give him all the answers that he wants. While we can provide responses relative to where things are in the entitlement phase or relative to the issuance of building permits, typically you look for additional information in terms of scheduling, which is not something they're required to provide, nor do we typically provide to the city. What I would like to do is see if there might be any community volunteers, if you know anyone who would like to work with us here in planning to help us maintain and update the information on our projects that are under construction. So if you know of anyone who has some spare time and would like to assist us with that project, if you could please direct them to me, and I've got some work for them to do.
So how would it work? Because I might be interested myself. Can I do it, being on the Planning Commission?
No reason why you couldn't do it. What we would do is give you the information we have on the projects. You would be able to contact the development team to see what type of updates that you might be able to get from them. So if that's something that you'd be interested in doing, we'd be more than happy to have you help us with that.
Yeah,
There you go, Peter.
Oh, and Charlie, are you volunteering too?
No, I said, there you go, Peter. That's a good job.
I'd be glad to do it. We'll have to see how much clout I have when I'll have to use a special voice. Well, maybe I'll use my mobster voice since I'm Italian.
Madam Chair, I don't have anything else. As there was already a question about the fulfillment center, we had originally thought that might come back at the end of the month for a study session. It will not. So our meeting on the 24th will begin at the regular time at 5:30 p.m. There won't be a study session in advance.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to adjourn our meeting until 5:30 p.m. on Wednesday, March 24th of 2021. Good night, all, and thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
And
Lynn, thank you.